So the first thing is what you want to look at is what we call your top 20 risk and opportunity areas. We've actually identified 20 risk and opportunity areas that you want to look at when you're talking about a Mexico operation. Now, all 20 of these are important. These are generally what we consider high priority areas. These are the same things that Mexican Customs is going to be looking at. And as I said, there's opportunity areas and there's risk areas. Now, if you look at the next slide, what you're going to see is it kind of breaks down into kind of three groups. Primarily when you're talking about a Mexican operation, there's three things going on in any Mexican operation. One, the import side, what you're bringing into the operation, which is basically your southbound shipments. Anything coming down into the maquila, there's certain requirements, certain obligations, certain responsibilities that you have to bring that product in. And one, in addition to the import, of course, the next big piece is the export.
Which again, you have to meet certain requirements to comply with the maquila processing requirements, basically. Again, mind you, for most of you, you probably already know that maquila operations really revolve around inventory control, which we'll get into in the next few slides.
So the third thing, which kind of gets into that, is now you've imported it and you can export it. The question then is the operation side, that managing that kind of day-to-day internal, which primarily is around in what the maquila really has to focus on is that kind of area in doing that, how you kind of manage that. So you really want to kind of focus on that as you're kind of setting that up and make sure that kind of works for you as you're setting that up.
Yeah.
So when you're looking at these operations, one of the things you're doing when you're talking about the import side, and on the next slide, we kind of break this out and talk about the key areas that you're going to look at on the import side. And the import side primarily is built around these areas. And why do you want to go through these? Because when you're talking about the import side, these are things that you have to focus on. These are things you have to get right on the import side into Mexico. This is, again, southbound moves.
That's correct. And most of these items that we're talking about right now, these are actually coded on the import pedimento. The import pedimento is essentially the equivalent of what we call the entry summary or the famous 7501. So these are elements that, for the most part, are on the pedimento. Product process identifiers, those are specific to the type of importation and product that you're bringing into the country. Raw material versus equipment, temporary versus permanent, those are all different situations where the coding has to be specific to that situation.
And it has to be correct coding, because when we're looking at that coding, if you do it wrong, then all of a sudden you haven't brought it into the facility the right way. Let's say you're bringing it as a definite when it's really a temporary. That can have a huge impact, because at that point, closing that out or not closing that out may or may not be an issue. So you want to be very clear that your identifiers are going to be clear.
That's right. Global identifiers, similar to the product and process identifiers, are also telling customs that you're doing a specific movement. The related party identifier, same as we have in the US, it's an identifying factor telling customs whether there's a relationship between the importer and the exporter.
And by the way, in most cases, of course, it should be related, because based on your maquila contract, this is the only company that you're essentially doing business with. So again, you want to be clear on that and make sure that matches. The next one, I know this comes up all the time.
All the time.
The Incoterm.
Incoterm, very, very important factor for Mexican customs when you're bringing a product. You want to make sure that you use a proper Incoterm, and they verify in an audit situation that truly that Incoterm is being met. Ex-works, FOB, DDP, that has to truly be in place in order for them to be compliant. Duties paid, obviously big deal. And one of the biggest things that's right now going on as far as with your ability to pay duties at the time of import, or whether you have the necessary setup to waive the duties because you've done certain processing in Mexico, which we'll talk about later on. PROSEC, similar to like a NAFTA or a free trade agreement, PROSEC is really a program that Mexico created so that foreign origin or non-originating items that are imported into the country can be imported duty-free or at a reduced duty rate when they're of non-NAFTA origin. Not everything is covered, but it's dependent basically on the industrial sector where your product falls.
Absolutely. So if you're actually paying duties, you definitely want to be looking at your PROSEC opportunities, because the first thing we look at, if we're seeing somebody that's actually paying duties, then why are they paying duties? PROSEC should cover most cases, and if you're not taking advantage of that, that could be wrong. In addition, you want to make sure you're using the right PROSEC indicators and the right program that you're in. Like we say, it's based on different industries, and you want to make sure you're in the right industry and you're making the right claim. Now, Regulatava Rule 8 is another option that you can also use to reduce duties, where sometimes it's not in PROSEC, but you can get more of a temporary exemption through the Rule 8 program. These are generally not permanent. They typically have to be renewed periodically, and they're also very company-specific when you get them on a company-by-company basis. PROSEC tends to be more industry-wide. Rule 8s are issued more on a maquila-by-maquila basis, but you need to manage those, you need to maintain those, you need to keep those updated. And again, if you're paying duties, PROSEC Rule 8 need to be looked at, because why are you paying duties? Now, I'm not saying you're always going to be exempt from duties. That's not the case here, but you want to make sure you're setting up the right process and that's being managed. You know, a lot of times I hear in Mexico, we hear this all the time, oh, Mexico's handling it. Mexico knows what they're doing. Don't worry about it. Well, again, if this is your operation and you own it, you control it, you manage it, how do you know that they're compliant?
Now, we know you trust your people, but what we're saying essentially is trust, but verify. That's all we're saying. Sensitive classifications, another big item for Mexican customs. If you're dealing, for example, in apparel, in textiles, in chemicals, and even in some automotive areas, there is some classifications that are for Mexican customs purposes considered sensitive. So there's more requirements, more compliance involved with having them. Valuation, same as it is in the US, where we have to comply with the proper valuation of the products that are being imported. Same goes for Mexico. You want to make sure that you're using either computed value, transaction value, or some other method that's approved.
And again, you have to have a backup to support that. The methodologies in Mexico are very similar to the US methodologies, but so many times there's no backup, there's no support. As far as Mexican customs is concerned, that valuation method must be provable, supportable, with sufficient documentation and backup, and they can challenge that method of valuation. So you want to make sure you pick a method, you can support it, you can defend it, whatever method that might be. And finally, the last thing, of course, NAFTA certificates of origin. If you are claiming NAFTA going into Mexico, obviously, if it's NAFTA eligible, you should certainly be doing that. You avoid all the duties that way. It's easy. You don't have to use PROSEC. You don't have to use Rule 8. You need to have those certificates in place at the time you make the claim. Again, does that exist? Now, if you go to the next slide, you're going to see we're going to talk a little bit more about the export side. Now, on the export side, there's a few other issues. Now, like Juan mentioned, on the import side, you have what we call a Mexican pedimento going in, an import pedimento. Actually, when you go out of Mexico, you have an export pedimento. It's pretty much the same kind of concept. And again, certain elements, Juan, that you do need to control when you move things out.
Definitely.
And those issues are kind of similar.
Similar to the ones that we saw on the import side, but a little different in some cases. Value plays an important role. It's interesting that for U.S. customs purposes, value on an export is really not that big of a deal. But for Mexican customs purposes, export value does play a role.
It's a huge deal. And the reason is remember, you have an obligation and a responsibility to manage that inventory by two methodologies, both by quantity and by value. You have to tie both of those together. And so with value and quantity, the only way you're really closing all this information out is you're giving information when it goes down south, and then you're giving information when it comes back north. All that has to tie together. All that has to be linkable and traceable. And again, a lot of times those things are not matchable. You can't even support them. So the reason these things do become quite important is because you're trying to meet your obligations and responsibilities for that. What comes in is what goes out.
Exactly.
And how do you do it? Well, you do it essentially through this import process and this export process. Dual use HTS classifications, I know, Juan, that's an issue that's come up quite a bit.
Yeah, same as we have in the U.S. for export purposes, same thing here. When they're exporting product from Mexico to the U.S., they're looking for any possible dual use classifications, which those need to be obviously treated differently.
Exactly, export control. Essentially, there is export control requirements in Mexico. They're not actually identical to the U.S. version of export control, but they do have those. You need to meet certain standards. There's related party identifier, again, like we saw before. There's those global identifiers.
Yes, very big and very, very important. Those key identifiers, either on the process coming in or the global identifiers at the entry level, very important that you get those accurately. And again, mind you, this is really not that big of a deal. It's really more of your people, your organization in Mexico, knowing which identifier to apply.
And being consistent.
Being
a lot of
consistent,
times, we
key.
see a lot of times they'll use an identifier and they don't even know why they're using
Exactly.
that identifier. So you need to select your identifiers that apply to your operations, which are generally going to repeat over and over again. And you need to monitor your pedimentos both in and out to make sure you're consistently using those identifiers, and your broker, your Mexican customs broker, is on the same page with you. A lot of times we'll see they'll set up identifiers in the system, and then all of a sudden they'll change.
Exactly.
And everybody's like throwing up their hands going, well, we don't know why it changed. Well, generally that's not going to work too well in an audit situation. Again, you need to know, you need to verify, and you need to validate. Now, if you go to the next screen, we're going to talk a little bit about the operational side. And as I said, you got the import side, you got the export side, you got everything in between. And this is where really most of the day-to-day work, the real operational is working. And here we're talking about inventory control. And it's really based on what we call Annex 24, which is quantity, and Annex 31, which is value. And that's how you have to manage it. You have to have a system, and most of you will have a Maquila system, an inventory control system that you have that's generally going to be independent of your ERP. It's generally a separate system that's going to manage all of those ins and outs for inventory control. Well, the challenge in a Maquila operation, of course, is you're bringing down raw materials, you're bringing down parts and components, but you're shipping out finished goods. And so you need to offset that. So if I bring down a bunch of parts of a car and then I export just a car, then you got to decrement all those different parts that you essentially used in that car, because you're not shipping out one for one. Most of you aren't going to do that. You're not going to bring a part down and send that part back. Typically what you're going to do is send out part and a bunch of parts, and then you're going to send out a finished good or a complete sub-assembly or something else. And your system has to be good enough to kind of decrement all of that. So bill of material control, accurate, updated, maintained bill of materials. Now, most of you, of course, are going to be pulling these bill of materials from your ERP system and typically dumping those bill of materials into your Maquila system. Question is, are those two systems even talking at all? Because a lot of times they're not talking, or they're not updating on a regular basis, or they're not communicating well, or when they say, well, they're talking, but they're not talking efficiently, they're not talking accurately. So those are things you need to really make sure you set up. The big thing, one, I say after that, huge inventory of equipment.
Definitely. One of the things that Customs looks for in inventory of equipment is really the proof that you legally imported all of that machinery, all of that tooling, all of those sophisticated pieces of equipment that you have in Mexico legally. And the way they do that is by model number, serial number, or some form of reference that specifically ties the import pedimento into Mexico to the actual piece of equipment physically. So in a verification, what you would expect is for the authorities to walk into your floor and physically go to each machine with the pedimento in hand and verify that it matches number by number. That's how detailed that verification is.
Well, because everything in the Maquila, when you're talking about machinery and equipment, generally is put down there on a definite importation rather than a temporary.
Yes.
You're bringing down the material, typically temporary. You need to move that out in a certain amount of time. But machinery equipment is going to stay down there more permanently. So typically you do a definite importation. So what they're looking for is to see, did you legally import that, or did you try to do a workaround, which we've seen, where they do a temporary, and they're not supposed to, they're supposed to do a definite and have essentially maybe paid duties or paid some certain costs associated with that. That is huge. In fact, I would say that number 1 and 2 right there, inventory control and inventory of equipment control, 1 and 2 in terms of priority. Now, permit validation, again, when you're operating down in Mexico, you're operating for certain operations. Certainly you have a permit to do certain things, maybe to do manufacturing, maybe to do assembly, maybe just to do repackaging and warehousing.
Right.
It depends. You need to make sure that your permit matches your operations and what you're doing. What happens is operations change, your permit now is invalid, or it's not really matching what you're doing. So you need to make sure that your permit is periodically validated to be sure, is it a one-to-one match on your actual operations at that facility. We see a lot of times that the permits are so outdated, they've never been updated, including your Maquila contract has never been updated. And they say, well, it's the one we set up 15 years ago. And it's like, this is completely obsolete. This doesn't even apply to what you're doing today. So again, don't assume anything, check it, verify it, validate it. And we go in and we look at these operations. These are all the things we're going to look at very, very quickly. It's a pretty fast process, but you need to know what you're looking for and what you're really targeting. And that's the hard part about auditing, not just knowing the item, but being able to really go through it and pull out what works. Now, Juan, I would say this is the next big thing is the EVA certification.
Yes.
Just because of the things that have changed recently.
Definitely. It's a fairly new requirement, but EVA certification is a huge, huge deal. Basically, what you're getting approval on is your ability to waive the payment of that EVA at the time of importation.
And EVA won how much?
16%.
16%. So in theory, what happened is when they changed this rule about a year and a half or so ago, you are now obligated as a maquila to pay EVA 16% on all your imports into Mexico. Period. No exceptions. Well, the only way you can get out of that is you have to get what's called an EVA certification, and you actually apply for this and you get certified, and it's usually good, I think, for about 2 years.
2 years.
And then you have to renew it. Well, all of you should hopefully have EVA certification, but not only that, you need to be maintaining your EVA certification, because when you applied for it, you told the government that you're going to be doing certain things, and essentially staying compliant is one of them. And if you don't, and you lose that EVA certification, you got to come up with all that cash up front. For some operations, that would be devastating if they had to come up with that kind of status.
Definitely. And losing that certification is terrible because they basically penalize you for 2 years. If you have the certification and you lose it because of lack of compliance, they penalize you for 2 years, meaning that even if you have everything in line to comply now, you have to wait 2 years in order for you to be able to be welcomed again. So
yeah, and one of the challenges, a lot of people say, I'm not going to deal with it, I have to deal with it. Unfortunately, we do work with maquilas that have had to deal with it. It's too late.
Oh, it's too late.
You lost it, and they're saying, well, can you go get it back? And it's like, well, no, you can't.
But it's
Under the rule, they're not going to give it back to you for about 2 years, and you have to jump through a lot of hoops even to get it back. So again, don't wait. Try to make sure that you're doing the right thing. If you've applied for a certification, whether it's EVA certification or even what we call certified maquila status, which is another certification you should certainly have, and a lot of benefits associated with that, don't think these are just things on a paper that you apply for. These are obligations and responsibilities that you're taking on, and you need to meet some of those certification standards. The final one I didn't even mention here was OEA certification.
Exactly, I was going to mention that.
And OEA certification, which is equivalent to the combination of a CT pad
/ compliance.
/ compliance. All of you should be joining now the OEA program. We strongly recommend it simply because the benefits associated with OEA are extremely high. It gives you a lot of great benefits in that program. So certified maquila is kind of getting replaced a bit by the OEA program. That's where most maquilas are going. And EVA certification is kind of separate from that. But you certainly want to have that to the highest tier. There's actually 3 tiers of EVA certification. You want to be up in that 3rd tier, the highest one, because you get the most benefits out of that program.